It is not so difficult to live the life that leads to heaven as is believed. Have you ever seen a cornerstone being laid for the beginning of a new building? Some people say they have. Perhaps they saw the cornerstone that I showed during the children's talk, the one that is just back here. And if you happen to be here, some of you weren't alive back then, some of you didn't live here, or perhaps you had something else that had to be done that day. So when the cornerstone was laid, perhaps you got a chance to see that taking place. Of course, it's representative of the cornerstone of your life, that we are building, the Lord, hopefully, within us, is building the life of heaven, and that He is the cornerstone to that temple of our lives. And as oftentimes people tease one another, another brick in your heavenly home because you do something good. That's not exactly the way it works. But there's some correspondence to that idea that as we are living a life that leads to heaven, the Lord is building that heavenly home for us in our future heavenly societies. How future is that? Well, as a matter of fact, if your heavenly home isn't now being built, you're not going to find it all of a sudden constructed when you reach the other world. It is being built, as it were, brick by brick, right now, with all the decisions, all the ideas and intentions, and all the behaviors, all the acts that we do on earth, is building our heavenly home. And there are many things that go into that building. How many of you have ever actually built a house or a building? Perhaps if you've been in the construction building business, you know it begins with a lot of preparatory work. And so we come to church, we send children to school to learn the stories of the Word that lay that foundation, that begin the process by which our minds can receive a heavenly home. And we're told in the section we read from Heaven and Hell, there's a whole chapter that is just about it's not so difficult to live the life that leads to heaven as many people believe. You can almost imagine as those words were being written by Swedenborg, we don't want to look too much at him personally or his personality, but he was a man of a certain time. And we too are living in our times. But perhaps more commonly would be seen people who were living a pious life and making a display of it. That people would believe that to live a life that leads to heaven meant you were continually in prayer, reading nothing but the Word and pious books, praying continuously, going to the temple or to the church on a regular daily basis, and denouncing all things of the world. And this passage specifically says you cannot denounce all things of the world. The world isn't an evil place. But the idea that we are supposed to be separated from the world has led and been twisted into an idea that somehow the world is evil. People who are denouncing the passions of the flesh, the concupiscences of the world, as it says in the Latin, and they believe that they must leave every pleasure of the world behind, and perhaps go and sit upon some mountaintop as the elements blow, or go put themselves away on some island and live amidst the rocks, that would be truly showing their spiritual dedication to God. Well, there are people who still believe that and who follow that ideal of following God by putting everything but God behind. This might be a small beginning of leading to a life of heaven, to really focus, for us to spend some time in a retreat setting. And many people will speak of the power of going into a retreat setting where perhaps they don't speak for a whole week. Perhaps they are dedicated to pious materials, and they're in prayer on a regular basis. We are to dedicate one day a week, one time to the Sabbath, where we're instructed in the things of the Lord's Word, but we cannot spend all of our lives apart from the world and thinking that we're serving God because we have no pleasures in the world and have put away our passions for all worldly things. In fact, the passage from Heaven and Hell tells us that people who live like that, well, there's a couple different names for them in common parlance that we would say. They're party poopers. They're a drain. They're people that you don't want to actually spend too much time with because they're so intense. They're always thinking of nothing but deep spiritual things. And we're told that they actually suck the life out of the joy of heaven, and the angels do not want to be around people who are simply so intensely involved with their own mental processes, their own spiritual intensity, that everything else is to the side. No, we're told that it's not difficult to live the life that leads to heaven because everybody can be engaged in the things of the world that have to do with being useful to people around you. Imagine how far this cornerstone would have gotten if there were no people to come and to help lay the cornerstone, put the bricks in order, do the beautiful stained glass, carve the wood, lay all the things out, lay down the carpet and the foundations and all the cement and all the brick and all the... Imagine if all of those had said, no, I'm going to go serve God. Well, we wouldn't have a church building. Somebody has to do the work. Someone has to perform the uses that make spiritual life more comfortable, makes our ability to serve one another and our neighbor in a church building actually something that is practical to do. All services, from the building of a temple or a church, to the serving of food, to the changing of diapers, to the washing of clothes, to the fixing of cars, to the industry and building of corporations that help develop. You can go on and on with all the business of the world. It's not so difficult to live the life that leads to heaven. You don't have to leave all those things behind. We have to engage in those things with the intention of serving the life of heaven within them. So there is the common old expression of somebody walking up to two workmen on a building site, and they each have a stone and some mortar, and the one is asked, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm just putting this brick right here." He puts the brick into place. He has his mind just focused on the work he's doing. He's going to think about what he's going to do at the end of the day. He's going to think about how he's going to spend the weekend and go off and take his paycheck and have fun. And the person comes to the next person and says, "What are you doing?" He does exactly the same thing. He says, "I'm building a cathedral." Because he's performing his use with the idea of his small part in a large edifice that has to do with the worship of the Lord. And it could be the building of a church. It could be the building of this church. That anybody serving the use, performing a use in the world, as mediocre as it might seem, just slapping some more cement on another brick and laying it in place, with the intention to serve the Lord, you're building a cathedral or a temple, a church. Oh, no, I'm just putting a brick in its place. It's not so difficult to live the life that leads to heaven. For everyone, it says, can act justly and sincerely in the things that they do in both moral and civil life. And in this chapter in Heaven and Hell, it goes into the explanation that the commandments, the 10 commandments that are given, the first 3, and it divides them up, have to do with spiritual life. And that is, of course, loving the Lord, having a Sabbath day, not taking the Lord's name in vain. Spiritual things. And the next 4 have to do with the civil life. Don't murder, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't lie. And the last 3 have to do with the moral life. Not to covet your neighbor, not to bear false witness. I'm not sure I got all of them in order or gave you all of them, but each one has to do with the way we relate to other people around us, either on a moral level or a civil level. Everybody can follow the teachings of the Ten Commandments and live a civil and a moral life. It's not so difficult. As a matter of fact, everybody learns very young, even if they don't sincerely believe they shouldn't steal, they won't steal because they don't want to get into trouble. They don't want to get caught. And we're told that the bounds of honor, reputation, and glory, or honor, reputation, and gain, these things keep us in check on a civil and a moral level. Can we live that life to be a just and an honest person, even externally? Everybody seems to be able to do it. There are those people who perhaps are psychopathical, have illnesses which lead them to have no conscience. They can't see not only the rock of truth of the divine human, but they can't see any reason why they should behave in such a manner. But that is a mental illness, and the Lord, we pray that that doesn't strike any of us. But each one of us in a state of health can see that to live a moral and civil life is not so difficult. So this section in Heaven and Hell reminds us that if you are able to live the Ten Commandments, you're able to understand what it is to be honest and sincere, simply turn to the Lord and say, these are the Lord's precepts. The other section of the lesson from Heaven and Hell, which I read, had to do with what one should do, a habit that should be formed. It says, when anything presents itself to the mind, which a person knows to be unjust or dishonest, to which your mind is born or drawn. So for one person, it might be stealing horses, and for another person, it might be committing adultery, and for another person, it might be taking the Lord's name in vain. But you go, this is an unjust thing. And if I pointed in your direction, it was random. To which your mind is born, to which your mind intends or tends to go. We're told that we inherit evil tendencies of all kinds. So if you find yourself inclining towards some evil, don't blame yourself, and don't even blame your parents or your grandparents. You can blame the people of the most ancient church if you need to blame someone, but just recognize that we are all created from dirt. We're all created to become the image and likeness of the Lord, but we all incline or inherit a tendency towards evils of every kind, and in our particular case, in your particular case, in another person's particular case, they incline towards one direction of evils more than you do. And you incline towards your own evils more than they do. So our minds are born or drawn towards particular evils that other people may not be having any kind of trouble with. And that section in Heaven and Hell says, when something presents itself to our mind that we know to be unjust or unfair, to which our mind is born, we ought simply to say to ourselves, this is against the Lord's divine precepts. How difficult is that? It's like diet and exercise, right? We all know if we want to stay healthy, we need to look at our diet and our exercise, and some other things as well. And you might know from your own medical history that the diet has to be a certain things and not other things, and the exercise has to be certain things and not other things. But it's like diet and exercise. How hard is that? Find it hard? Well, okay, but we know, if I hand you something that I'm going to say, this is going to really make you feel terrible, go ahead and eat it. You'll go, oh, no way. If I tell you I'd like you to run laps on Burnham Thorpe, you're going, that's a terrible place to exercise. So it's not that difficult, is it? To look at something and say, this won't work. This isn't good for me. You might want to eat haggis, but I really don't prefer to eat that. Or you might really like, oh boy, I got to be careful because somebody's going to say they really love tofu and there I slammed it in church. You might like to eat kipper snacks, which I do, but I don't want any. Each of us must look at the things towards which our minds are born, our affections draw us, and say, this is evil. And foods, I'm not going to go into what evil foods there are, or evil exercises, but think about that in its correspondential manner concerning our spirits, what we take in, what we consume, spiritually speaking, and then, of course, what we do, how we exercise our free will. Spiritual diet and exercise, it's the same thing. How difficult is it when we know that we're born with an appetite towards certain things to go, I don't want to consume that. I don't want to think that way. I don't want to believe those things about that person or about myself or about the Lord. This goes against the precepts of the Lord's 10 Commandments for me to behave this way. I don't want to take that in, and I don't want to act that out. So it says in that passage, how difficult it is that a person needs to look at what presents itself to their minds, to which they're particularly interested or born towards going, and say to themselves, this I will not do. And we're told if a person gets in such a habit to think that way, of course not do it, but to think also that way, the Lord then opens your spiritual mind, opens the higher elements of your mind, and builds a conjunction with you in heaven, which kind of goes back to the building of the spiritual home in heaven. The Lord is building you into his image and likeness. How difficult is it to live the life that leads to heaven? It's not so difficult as some people believe. All of us can act in a civil and a moral manner. Just add on that the Lord wishes me to act in a spiritual manner within those things, and not to simply be bound by fear or the loss of honor, reputation, or gain or glory. If those things are the only things binding us to our behaviors, we have to keep looking for the Lord to be the source of our direction to find him. The Lord to be the source of the reasons why we're behaving in a civil and in a moral way. If we do that, then we do indeed see the stone. We see the Lord's life in all things. We know, because I've just talked about it, that there's a cornerstone down here. I've taken a picture of it. You might not have thought about that cornerstone for years if you saw it being laid, or remember being here during the laying of the foundation or the dedication of this particular building. You might not have thought about it, and if I had just shown you this picture and you'd actually been here, you might not have actually recognized it because you haven't seen it for such a long time. The Lord is building you into his image and likeness, becoming a temple for our God. And you don't always see everything involved with it. You don't always reflect. It becomes a matter of habit to live the life that leads to heaven. But you will see when you're on that journey in the other world and you see the rock that divides your evil intentions towards your good intentions, you will see and you'll be dedicated because you've made it a habit to follow the pathway that leads to heaven. It's not so difficult to live the life that leads to heaven. Amen.